"Sir, your vest is torn." Annie said it while holding the vest up with both hands, the fabric slipping slightly because it was heavier than it looked. She lifted it closer to the light above the sewing table, her small fingers pinching the edge of the tier. The rip ran along the side seam, clean but unmistakable. The man nodded. "Yes," he said. "It got caught on the car door." He looked down at the vest again, then at her. Really looked this time. A little black girl, no older than 6, standing barefoot on a wooden stool so she could reach the table. Her hair was tied back loosely. Her face was calm, unreadable, too calm for a child her age. He hesitated. "You're the one who works here?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "My grandma works here. I help." Help. The word didn't sit well with him. He glanced around the shop. Old machines, shelves of thread, worn floors polished smooth by decades of footsteps. It was clean, but tired, like the neighborhood outside, like something that had survived by refusing to quit. He exhaled sharply and reached for the vest. "I'm sorry," he said, already folding it over his arm. "I don't mean to waste your time. I thought—" He stopped himself. He had meant to say, "I thought there'd be a tailor here, an adult one. I need this fixed properly, tonight." Annie didn't pull the vest away. She tightened her grip. "I can fix it," she said. He paused, one eyebrow lifting despite himself. "You can?" "Yes, sir." He studied her again, this time more carefully. Her hands were small. Too small, he thought, to handle fabric this expensive, this delicate, this unforgiving. He imagined the boardroom, the eyes that would scan him tomorrow morning, the judgments made in seconds. A sloppy seam would be worse than a tear. "I don't doubt you mean well," he said, lowering his voice. "But this isn't a school project. This is a custom vest. Italian wool. If it's done wrong—" "I won't do it wrong," Annie said. The certainty in her voice made him stop mid-sentence. Behind her, an elderly woman looked up from her chair by the wall. Annie's grandmother hadn't said a word since he walked in, but now she stood slowly, her joints protesting just enough to be heard. "She's telling you the truth," the woman said. "If she says she can do it, she can." The man looked at the grandmother, then back at Annie. "With respect," he said, "she's a child. We're being frank." "So was I when I learned," the grandmother replied evenly. So was her mother. Annie lifted the vest again, turning it so he could see the tear clearly. "Look," she said. "The thread broke before the fabric. That means it can be pulled back together." He blinked. "You know that?" She nodded. "Cheap thread on good cloth. My mom said that happens when people rush." The words landed harder than he expected. He had built his entire career on speed, on moving faster than competitors, faster than doubt. Rushing was how deals were won. He shifted his weight, conflicted. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. "I don't have time for mistakes," he said. "If this doesn't hold—" "It will," Annie said again. Not louder, not defensive, just certain. He looked down at the vest, then back at the door, rain streaking the glass beyond it. He could leave, try another shop, but the street outside was dark, and the rain wasn't slowing. And somewhere deep inside him, something bristled at the idea of walking away because of who she was. "Show me," he said. Annie's eyes flicked to her grandmother, who gave a small nod. Annie climbed back onto the stool and laid the vest flat on the table. She smoothed it carefully, aligning the seams the way she'd been taught. Then she reached for a piece of chalk and marked a tiny line near the tear. "I have to open it more first," she explained, glancing up at him, "so it doesn't pull later." "Open it more?" he repeated, uneasy. She picked up a seam ripper. Her grip practiced, controlled. With slow precision, she loosened the damaged stitches, not tearing but releasing them. Thread by thread, the rip widened slightly, just enough to reveal the structure underneath. The man leaned closer without realizing it. "You're making it bigger," he said. "So I can make it stronger," Annie replied. She selected a spool of thread from a box beneath the table, dark gray, nearly identical to the original, but thicker. She held it up. "This one won't snap," she said. "My grandma buys the good kind." The grandmother smiled faintly but said nothing. Annie threaded the needle, missing once, then succeeding. She tugged the thread tight, tested it with a small pull, and began to sew. Her stitches were slow, deliberate, each one placed with care. She didn't rush, even when the man shifted beside her, even when his phone buzzed again. Minutes passed. Then more. He watched as she worked, his doubt slowly giving way to something else: surprise. Maybe respect. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed steady. She paused only to check tension, to smooth the fabric, to make sure the seam lay flat. "I've seen professionals do worse," he muttered before he could stop himself. Annie didn't look up. "Some people don't care," she said. "They just want it to look done. And you? I want it to stay done." When she finished, she tied the thread, cut it clean, and ran her fingers along the seam. She pressed gently, testing the strength. Then she held the vest up. "Try," she said. He took it from her, pulling it on slowly, carefully. He rolled his shoulders once, then again. The fabric moved smoothly, no strain, no pull. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror on the wall. The tear was gone, not hidden, not disguised, gone. He turned back to Annie, genuinely stunned. "I was wrong," he said quietly. She shrugged, already climbing down from the stool. "It happens." He laughed once, breathless, the sound surprising both of them. "Yes," he said, "it does." Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside the small, tired shop, a 6-year-old girl had just proved something neither of them would forget. And the man no longer felt quite so certain that leaving had ever been an option. The man didn't leave right away. He stood near the sewing table, vest still on, fingers brushing the seam as if trying to catch it lying to him. He pulled gently, then harder, testing the fabric the way he tested everything else in his life. It didn't give. The seam held, quiet and confident. "Stronger than before," he said under his breath. Annie was already cleaning up. She placed the scissors back in their jar, lined the spools of thread by color the way her grandmother liked them. To her, the work was finished. What came after didn't belong to the vest. Her grandmother watched the man closely. She had seen his kind before, not this one exactly, but men who carried urgency like a second coat. Men used to being obeyed. Men who mistook doubt for weakness and certainty for control. "You should take it off slowly when you get home," the grandmother said. "Don't rush it tonight." He nodded, still distracted. "Of course." He reached into his coat pocket, then stopped, looked at Annie, looked at the grandmother. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. The grandmother didn't answer right away. She walked over to the table and picked up the vest tag Annie had set aside. Her fingers traced the brand name. She knew exactly what it meant. "For the work?" she asked. "Yes." She handed the tag back to Annie. "Tell him." Annie looked up. "We didn't talk about money." The man frowned slightly. "I understand that. But now the work is done." "Was no so." Annie considered that, then shook her head. "It's still raining. You're still here." Something about the way she said it, simple, factual, made his chest tighten. "I'm happy to pay," he said, more firmly now. "More than fair. This vest, this isn't ordinary fabric." Her grandmother's voice cut in, calm but immovable. "And my granddaughter's work isn't ordinary either." The man met her eyes. There was no challenge there. No need to prove anything. Just a line drawn cleanly. He exhaled and gave a short, almost embarrassed laugh. "You're right," he said. "I didn't mean to." "I know," she said. "Most people don't." Annie climbed back onto the stool and swung her legs gently, the crisis already fading from her mind. She picked up a scrap of fabric and began practicing tiny stitches along the edge, just because she liked the way they lined up. The man watched her for a moment. "You do this often?" he asked. She nodded. "When people need it." "It's nodding." "When people pay?" he pressed. Annie stopped stitching and looked at him. "When people need it." The grandmother smiled at that, just a little. The man glanced at his watch again. 9:12 p.m. He should have been furious by now, panicked, making calls, pacing. Instead, he felt oddly still. My meeting, he said slowly. It's not far. If the rain eases, I can walk. The grandmother raised an eyebrow. In those shoes? He looked down at them, polished leather, already spotted with water. I've walked worse. She nodded once. Then you'll be fine. He turned toward the door, then hesitated. I didn't get your name, he said to Annie. She tilted her head. You didn't ask. He smiled despite himself. Fair enough. He stopped. The name rose easily to his lips, a name that opened doors, silenced rooms. Tonight, it felt heavy. I'm just someone who needed help, he finished. If this moment moved you even a little, take a second to like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if you believe quiet acts of kindness still matter, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this. Annie accepted that answer without question. I'm Annie. He repeated it quietly. Annie. He opened the door. Rain spilled in, cold and sharp. He stepped out, then paused, looking back once more. You were right, he said, not sure who he was speaking to now. About the thread, the grandmother inclined her head. Good things last when you build them right. The door closed behind him. The shop felt smaller without him in it. The rain louder. Annie hopped down from the stool. Grandma, she said. He was scared. Her grandmother nodded. Yes, he was. He didn't look scary. People rarely do when they're honest, the woman replied. Annie thought about that as she put the vest tag away in the drawer where lost things waited to be claimed or forgotten. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping. The man walked quickly. Head down, vest pulled tight around him. Water soaked through his sleeves, ran down his collar, but he barely noticed. His mind kept circling back to the shop, to the quiet certainty in that child's voice. I can fix it. He reached the corner and stopped under a streetlight. He rolled his shoulders again, feeling the strength of the seam. The vest moved with him, uncomplaining. His phone buzzed. Service, finally. 3 missed calls, 2 texts, 1 voicemail. He didn't listen yet. He thought of Annie's hands, small, sure, unafraid of doing something right even when it took longer. He thought of the grandmother's eyes, sharp and steady, unimpressed by urgency. He started walking again. By the time he reached the building where the meeting was being held, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. The lobby lights glowed warm behind glass doors. People inside moved with purpose, oblivious to the storm. A security guard glanced at him as he entered, then nodded, reassured by the clean line of his vest, the confidence of his stride. No one noticed the seam. At the long table upstairs, faces turned when he walked in. Conversations stopped. Someone checked the time pointedly. Apologies, he said, taking his seat. I had an unexpected delay. Eyes flicked to his vest, then away. Satisfied, the meeting began. Numbers were discussed. Projections argued. Risks weighed. He spoke when necessary. Listened more than usual. Once or twice, his fingers brushed the seam again, grounding him. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th agenda item, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he wasn't certain he was the most capable person in the room, and that thought didn't frighten him nearly as much as it should have. Back at the shop, Annie helped her grandmother lock up for the night. They turned off the lights one by one, leaving the sewing table for last. You did good work, her grandmother said. Annie shrugged. I always do. The old woman smiled, tired and proud. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Some things, it seemed, had already been set in motion. The morning after the storm arrived quietly, as if the night had never happened. Sunlight slipped through the front window of the tailor shop, catching dust in the air and settling gently on the sewing table where Annie had worked late into the night. The rain had washed the street clean, leaving behind damp pavement and the faint smell of wet concrete. From the outside, nothing looked different. The sign was still faded. The glass still carried small cracks at the corners. The neighborhood still moved at its usual slow, cautious pace. Inside, Annie sat cross-legged on the floor with a bowl of cereal balanced in her lap. Her grandmother stood at the counter, counting out pills into a small plastic organizer. Her movements were careful, unhurried. The radio played softly in the background, an old soul station. the kind that spoke about love and loss without raising its voice. "You eat before it gets soggy," her grandmother said without looking up. "I like it soggy," Annie replied. Her grandmother snorted. "You would." Annie spooned up the last of the cereal and set the bowl aside. She wiped her hands on her shorts and climbed to her feet. "Is the man coming back?" she asked. Her grandmother paused, then resumed counting. "What man?" "The vest man." She smiled faintly. "People don't usually come back once they get what they need." Annie frowned, considering that. He looked like he forgot something. Her grandmother capped the pill container and met her granddaughter's eyes. "Sometimes people don't know what they've forgotten until much later." The bell over the door jingled. Both of them looked up. It wasn't the man from the night before. It was Mrs. Carter from 3 doors down, her purse tucked under her arm, her face already lined with apology. "I just need a button sewn," she said. "If you're open." "We're open," the grandmother replied. Annie fetched the button jar without being asked. The morning passed the way mornings always did. Small jobs, quiet conversations, neighbors stopping in not just for sewing, but to talk, to be seen. Annie helped where she could, handing over pins, sweeping thread from the floor, listening more than speaking. Still, her eyes kept drifting to the door. Across town, the man sat alone in his office. The meeting had ended hours earlier. The deal had gone through. Papers were signed. Hands were shaken. People congratulated him on his composure under pressure. He nodded. He smiled. He accepted the praise, but his attention was elsewhere. He stood by the window, jacket draped over the back of his chair, vest still on. Sunlight streamed in, catching the seam Annie had repaired. Invisible. Perfect. He pressed his thumb against it, harder this time. It held. On his desk lay a legal pad filled not with numbers or notes, but a single name written at the top. Annie. He didn't know why he'd written it, only that he had. The phone rang. His assistant's voice followed, efficient and precise. "Sir, your schedule for the afternoon." "Cancel it," he said. A pause. "All of it." "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. Understood. He hung up and reached for his jacket. As he slid his arms into it, he felt a strange reluctance, as if he were stepping out of something that mattered. He shook the thought away. By noon, the shop was quiet again. Annie sat at the sewing table, practicing straight stitches on a scrap of denim. Her grandmother watched from the counter, hands folded around a mug of coffee. "You're thinking loud," she said. Annie glanced up. "Am I? You keep looking at the door." Annie stitched another line. "I don't think he knew how to wait." Her grandmother chuckled. "Most people don't. Do you think he learned?" The older woman considered the question carefully. "Learning isn't the same as remembering," she said. "That part takes time." The bell rang again. This time, Annie knew before she looked. The man stood just inside the doorway, dry now, clean-shaven. His hair neatly combed. He wore the same vest. He didn't speak at first. Neither did they. Then Annie slid off her chair and walked over, stopping a few feet in front of him. "You came back," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I did, too." Her grandmother watched him closely, measuring not his clothes, but his posture. He wasn't in a hurry this time. "I didn't forget anything," he said, almost to himself. "I just wanted to make sure." "To make sure of what?" the grandmother asked. He looked at her, then at Annie. That the work was real. Annie lifted the edge of his vest and examined the seam again, as if seeing it for the first time. She nodded once. "It's still good." He smiled. Not the polite kind, the kind that surprised him. "I thought so." He reached into his pocket, then stopped. His hand came out empty. "I'm not here to pay," he said. "I know you don't like that." The grandmother raised an eyebrow. "We don't like being rushed." He inclined his head. "Understood." Annie tilted her head. "Then why are you here?" He took a breath. "Because I don't think people should disappear after they help someone." The room felt smaller suddenly, quieter. The grandmother gestured to the chair by the counter. "Sit," she said. "If you're going to talk, you might as well do it properly." He sat. Annie climbed back onto her stool and picked up her needle again, listening without staring. "I've been thinking about last night," he said. About what you said. About not selling fixing. Annie threaded the needle. Some things aren't for sale. Yes, he said softly. That's what scares people. Her grandmother folded her arms. It scares the wrong ones. He nodded slowly. I think I've been one of them. Annie paused her stitching. You didn't look scary today. He laughed quietly. I'm working on that. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, a bus passed. Its brakes hissing. I don't want this to be the last time we talk, he said. But I also don't want to be the kind of man who shows up only when it suits him. The grandmother studied him. Then don't be. He met her gaze. I won't. Annie tied off her thread and looked up. If you come back, she said seriously, you have to wait like everyone else. He smiled. I think I can manage that. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. Annie, he said. Yes? You were right about something else too. What? Good work lasts. She nodded. That's what my mom said. He opened the door and stepped back into the sunlight, leaving the shop exactly as he'd found it except for the space he now carried with him. Annie watched him go, then returned to her stitching. Some lessons didn't need to be loud. The fourth day after the storm arrived with heat, it settled into the neighborhood early, heavy and unmoving, the kind of heat that made people walk slower and talk less. The tailor shop's front door was propped open with a chipped wooden block, letting in what little breeze there was. The faded sign above it creaked faintly, the sound lost under the distant hum of traffic. Annie sat at the sewing table, her feet swinging. She was stitching the edge of a hand towel. Not because it needed fixing, but because her grandmother believed hands should never forget what they knew. Small stitches, her grandmother reminded from the back room. Even when it doesn't matter, Annie nodded. It always matters. Her grandmother smiled to herself. By mid-morning, the shop filled with the usual faces. Mrs. Carter came back for her button, this time with a paper bag of biscuits as thanks. Mr. Lewis from the corner barber shop brought in a pair of slacks and stayed longer than necessary, talking about the way things used to be when the block was busier, louder, alive. Annie listened. She always did. People said things around children they didn't say around adults. They assumed the words would float over her head, disappear. But Annie collected them carefully, like loose thread. Around 11, a black sedan rolled slowly past the shop. Annie noticed it immediately. It wasn't flashy, but it didn't belong. It moved too quietly, too deliberately, like it was counting doors. The car didn't stop. It disappeared down the street and turned the corner. Annie's needle paused. Grandma, she said. Yes, baby. There was a car. Her grandmother came to the doorway and looked out. What kind of car? Black, quiet. Her grandmother nodded once. Then it's probably nothing. But she closed the door anyway. Across town, the man sat in a conference room that felt colder than it needed to be. The windows were tinted, the walls glass. Everything was designed to keep the outside world at a safe distance. Around the table sat men and women in pressed suits. Legal counsel, operations, communications, people who spoke carefully and listened harder. We should move quickly, one of them said. If the story leaks, it won't stay small. The man leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. It's not a story, he said. It's a fact. A pause followed. With respect, another voice said. Facts become stories the moment people feel something about them. He looked at the speaker. And what do you think people would feel? The room was quiet. Conflicted, someone said finally. Inspired, angry, depends on who's telling it. He nodded slowly. Then we tell it ourselves. The lawyer at the far end cleared his throat. Sir, this involves a minor. Well, that's why we do nothing without permission, the man replied. And why we don't bring cameras. A few exchanged glances. This isn't charity, he continued. And it isn't marketing. If we can't keep it clean, we don't do it at all. Silence again. This time, different. Back at the shop, the afternoon dragged. The heat pressed in through the walls. Annie finished her towel and set it aside neatly. She wiped her hands on her shorts and hopped down from the stool. Can I go get popsicles? She asked. Her grandmother smiled. From where? The freezer at Mr. Lewis's shop. He said we could. She considered it, then nodded. Stay on this block. I always do. Annie slipped out the door and into the sun. Halfway down the sidewalk, she saw the black sedan again. Parked now. Engine off. Her steps slowed. The driver's window rolled down. A man leaned slightly toward the opening. He wore a suit, even in the heat. His tie loosened just enough to suggest he understood discomfort without fully accepting it. Excuse me, he said. Are you Annie? Her stomach tightened. Yes, she said. I'm not here to scare you, he said quickly. I just need to ask a question. She didn't answer. He noticed her hesitation and nodded. That's fair. Would you like me to step out of the car? She thought about her grandmother's voice, about the door closing. Yes, she said. He stepped out slowly, hands visible. My name is Richard, he said. I work for someone you met a few nights ago. Annie's eyes narrowed. The vest man. Richard blinked, then smiled despite himself. Yes, him. What do you want? She asked. To understand, he said honestly. What happened? What you did? She crossed her arms. I fixed his vest. Yes, he said. But you didn't take his money, Annie shrugged. It wasn't broken money. Richard paused. He hadn't expected that. Your grandmother, he said carefully. Is she inside? Yes. May I speak with her? Annie thought for a long moment, then nodded. You have to wait. Richard smiled again. I can do that. They walked back together. Annie opened the door and stepped aside. My grandma says you don't rush, she said. Richard inclined his head. Your grandmother is wise. Inside, the air felt cooler, safer. The grandmother looked up as they entered. Her expression unreadable. Can I help you? She asked. Richard straightened. I hope so. But only if you're willing. She studied him, then gestured to the chair. Sit. He did. Annie stood beside her grandmother, close enough to feel the familiar warmth. I work for the man whose vest Annie repaired, Richard said. He wants to make sure no one is taken advantage of. The grandmother's eyes sharpened. By who? By anyone, he said carefully, including him. She considered that. Annie spoke up. He waited. Ever? Richard smiled. Yes, he did. That matters, Annie said. The grandmother placed a hand on Annie's shoulder. It does. Richard took a breath. All we're asking for now is time, and permission to come back. The grandmother met his gaze. We don't promise things we don't control. That's enough, he said. Outside, the black sedan sat quietly. Inside, something unseen but important shifted, just slightly, into place. The black sedan returned the next morning. It didn't park directly in front of the tailor shop this time. It stopped across the street, half a block down, where it wouldn't draw attention. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off, as if whoever was inside needed time to decide how to step out. Annie noticed it from the window. Remembering Richard's careful voice, his open hands, the way he had waited when she told him to, she didn't feel afraid. Not exactly, but she felt alert, the way her grandmother had taught her to feel when something unfamiliar entered a familiar space. Grandma, she said quietly. Her grandmother followed Annie's gaze and sighed once, slow and measured. All right, she said. Let's see what they think they want. The bell over the door rang. This time, it wasn't Richard alone. The man from the storm stepped inside, dressed simply now, no tie, sleeves rolled up, vest still on. Behind him came Richard, carrying a slim folder under his arm. No cameras, no entourage, just the two of them. The man paused as soon as he crossed the threshold, as if remembering himself. Good morning, he said. Morning, Annie replied before her grandmother could speak. Her grandmother raised an eyebrow but didn't correct her. The man smiled at Annie, the same surprised, unguarded smile she'd seen when he came back the first time. Good morning, Annie. He said her name carefully, like he didn't want to wear it out. You came back again, Annie said. Yes, he replied. I hope that's all right. Her grandmother stepped forward. That depends on why, he nodded. Fair. They stood there for a moment. The silence thick, but not hostile. Finally, the man spoke. I won't stay long, he said. And I won't ask for anything you don't want to give. Richard shifted slightly, as if resisting the urge to add something official sounding. He stayed quiet. The grandmother gestured to the chairs. Sit, she said. If you're going to speak, do it properly. They sat. Annie climbed onto her stool and rested her hands on the table. She didn't sew. She watched. I grew up believing money could fix most things, the man began. Time, problems, people. It made life efficient. The grandmother didn't respond. Her face gave nothing away. And then, he continued, a little girl told me she could fix something I couldn't. Annie blinked. You could have fixed it, she said. You just didn't know how. Richard glanced at her, startled. The man laughed softly. That might be the truest thing anyone said to me in years. He sobered. I'm not here to repay you. I know you don't want that. That's right, the grandmother said. I'm here because I don't want what happened to disappear, he said. Not the vest, the waiting, the care, the choice you made. Annie tilted her head. What choice? To do it right, he said. Even when no one was watching, the grandmother leaned back in her chair. People watch more than you think. Yes, he said. That's what worries me. Richard finally spoke. Sir, maybe, the man lifted a hand. Let me, he turned back to the grandmother. I run a company. A large one. We employ thousands of people. Most of them don't look like me. Many of them grew up in places like this. The grandmother's gaze sharpened. I make decisions every day that affect their lives, he went on. Wages, locations, closures. I've always told myself I was being fair, objective. But last week, a 6-year-old reminded me that fairness without dignity is just another excuse. Annie felt something warm spread through her chest, though she didn't fully understand why. I don't want to turn your kindness into a story, he said. I don't want headlines or praise. I want to make sure it leads somewhere real, he said. The grandmother folded her hands. And where exactly do you think that is? He took a breath. I want to invest in this shop. Annie's head snapped up. No, she said immediately. The word echoed louder than she'd expected. The man didn't flinch. He looked at her calmly. Okay, he said. Tell me why. Because then it's not ours, Annie said. It's yours. The grandmother's lips pressed together, pride flickering through her stern expression. The man nodded slowly. You're right. That was the wrong word. Richard cleared his throat. What he means, he said carefully, is support. Without ownership. Without control. The grandmother considered them both. Support has strings, she said. Even when people pretend it doesn't. Yes, the man agreed. That's why I'm here. To be honest about the strings, he leaned forward. I want to help repair what's been wearing thin in places like this. Training, tools, opportunities, not by taking over, but by strengthening what's already here. Annie frowned. Like the vest? A smile spread across his face. Exactly like the vest. You didn't replace it, she continued. You fixed what was broken. Yes, he said. And you made it stronger. The grandmother exhaled slowly. Words are easy. They are, he said. Which is why I didn't bring a check. Richard opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper onto the table. Not a contract. Not yet. Just a proposal, written plainly. Read it when you want, the man said. Or don't read it at all. Either way, nothing happens without your yes. Annie leaned forward, scanning the page. She couldn't read all of it, but she recognized enough. Sewing machines, classes, kids. Other kids? She asked. Yes, he said. Kids who like working with their hands. Kids who don't get picked first. Annie thought of herself at school, of teachers who spoke over her head, of worksheets that didn't make sense the way fabric did. They'd have to learn slow, she said. The man smiled. Good work always does. The grandmother closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, something in her had shifted, not softened, but steadied. We don't decide things like this in a day, she said. I wouldn't expect you to, he replied. Annie looked from her grandmother to the man. "You have to wait," she said. He nodded. "I know." Outside, the street hummed with ordinary life. Buses, footsteps, voices drifting past. Inside the shop, time stretched, then settled. The man stood. "Thank you for listening," he said. "That's more than I deserve." Annie watched him walk to the door. "Hey," she said. He turned. "You waited last time," she said. "That's why I helped you." He swallowed. "Then I'll keep waiting." When the door closed behind them, the shop felt different. Not changed, just aware. Annie climbed down from her stool. "Grandma?" "Yes, baby." "Fixing things makes people nervous," Annie said. Her grandmother smiled, tired and wise. "It should. It means something matters." Annie looked at the sewing table, at the needles and thread waiting patiently. Some things, once stitched, couldn't be pulled apart again. The proposal stayed on the sewing table for 3 days. It lay there beneath a paperweight shaped like a thimble, untouched, as if it might change if someone looked at it too closely. Annie noticed it every time she passed the table, the crisp white edges standing out against the worn wood. She didn't ask about it again. Her grandmother didn't bring it up. Life continued. Customers came and went. Hems were shortened. Sleeves were let out. Buttons replaced. Annie stitched and unstitched, learning as much from undoing mistakes as from getting things right the first time. Her grandmother corrected her gently, never raising her voice. "Slow hands make strong work," she said, guiding Annie's fingers. On the 4th afternoon, Annie heard raised voices outside, not shouting, not angry, just tense. She peered through the window and saw 2 men standing near the black sedan. One of them was Richard. The other wore a city badge clipped to his belt. They spoke quietly, heads bent together. Annie's stomach tightened. "Grandma," she said. Her grandmother came to the window and watched without comment. After a moment, Richard looked up and saw them. He raised one hand, not waving, just acknowledging. The man beside him nodded and stepped back, returning to his car. Richard crossed the street alone. He didn't come inside right away. He stood outside the shop, checking his phone, waiting. Annie opened the door before her grandmother could stop her. "You're early," Annie said. Richard smiled. "I was hoping that would be okay." She studied him. "Are you in trouble?" He chuckled softly. "No, but I don't like surprises." She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and stepped aside to let him in. Her grandmother looked up from the counter. "You said you'd wait." "I did," Richard replied. "But something came up." The grandmother didn't soften. "Things always do." "Well," Richard took a breath. "I wanted to let you know before you heard it from someone else. People have been asking questions." "What kind of people?" Annie asked. "The kind who notice when powerful men change their routines," Richard said gently. The grandmother's eyes narrowed. "Is he sending you to clean up a mess?" "No," Richard said quickly. "I came because I respect you, and because this shop deserves to be left alone." Annie crossed her arms. "Then why were there police?" Richard followed her gaze to the window. "They weren't here for you. They were here because someone reported an unusual presence in the neighborhood." Annie frowned. "What's unusual?" "Us," he said honestly. The grandmother sighed. "That's how it starts." Richard nodded. "That's why I'm here now. To say this clearly, if you say no, everything stops. He won't come back. I won't come back. And we'll make sure no one else does either." It was no. Annie looked at her grandmother. "What if we say yes?" Richard hesitated. "Then things will change. Not all at once, and not always comfortably." Silence settled between them. The grandmother reached for the proposal on the table and slid it closer. She didn't open it. She didn't tear it up either. "You talk about fixing," she said slowly. "But you come from a world that replaces." Richard nodded. "I do. And you work for a man who spent his life winning," she continued. "Not waiting." "Yes." She met his eyes. "Why now?" Richard didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Because I watched him sit in a boardroom full of people who've never been told no," he said. And he didn't interrupt anyone. He listened. "That's new." Annie tilted her head. Did he wait? Richard smiled. He did. The grandmother looked down at her hands, at the faint scars left by needles and years. Waiting is easy when you know you'll still be heard. Where Buddy? That's what he's trying to learn, Richard said. Annie climbed onto her stool and swung her legs. If you fix too fast, she said, it comes undone. Richard blinked. Is that something your grandmother taught you? Yes, Annie replied. And my mom. The grandmother closed her eyes briefly at the mention of her daughter. When she opened them, they glistened. Just a little. My daughter believed in doing things the hard way, she said. Because the easy way didn't last. Richard swallowed. I know. That surprised her. You didn't know her. No, he said. But I know what it costs to do things right. Outside, the afternoon sun dipped behind a passing cloud. The light in the shop shifted. Softer now. The grandmother finally opened the proposal. She read slowly. Once. Then again. Annie watched her face, trying to read what the words meant before they were spoken aloud. This isn't ownership, the grandmother said at last. No. Richard confirmed. It's access, tools, training, a promise not to interfere. And the children? They come because they want to. Richard said. They leave when they choose. The grandmother looked at Annie. What do you think? Annie thought about the kids at school who got sent to the corner for fidgeting. The ones who liked taking things apart more than sitting still. I think, she said carefully, that sewing teaches you how to pay attention. Richard smiled. That's exactly what we're hoping for, too. The grandmother folded the proposal closed. Hope isn't enough. I know. She set it back on the table. We'll decide. When we're ready. Richard nodded, relief visible in the way his shoulders dropped. That's all we ask. He stood to leave, pausing at the door. For what it's worth, he said. He hasn't stopped talking about Annie's hands. Annie blinked. That's weird. Richard laughed. It is, but it's also a start. After he left, the shop felt quieter than usual. Annie hopped down from her stool. Grandma? Yes, baby. Is it bad if people notice you? The grandmother considered that. Not if you're doing something worth noticing. Annie smiled and reached for her needle again. Outside, the black sedan drove away, slow and respectful this time. Inside, the sewing table waited. The question didn't leave Annie after Richard drove away. It stayed with her while she swept the shop floor, while she sorted buttons by color, while she sat on the stool practicing stitches so small her grandmother said they looked like they were whispering to the fabric, being noticed. Whether that was good or dangerous, whether the two could look the same at first. By the end of the week, the neighborhood noticed too. It started small. A woman Annie didn't recognize came in with a skirt and asked too many questions about the shop, about how long they'd been there, about whether business had picked up lately. She paid an exact change and didn't come back. Then a man from 2 streets over brought in a jacket and mentioned, casually, that he'd heard someone important had stopped by. Word travels, her grandmother said when Annie repeated it. Especially where it's not invited. Annie frowned. Should we tell it to stop? Her grandmother smiled sadly. If only it worked that way. On Saturday morning, the bell over the door rang earlier than usual. Annie looked up, expecting Mrs. Carter or Mr. Lewis. Instead, she saw a woman in her 30s, neatly dressed, holding the hand of a boy who looked about Annie's age. The boy's eyes darted around the shop, curious but wary. Are you open? The woman asked. We are, Annie's grandmother said. The woman hesitated. I heard you might teach. The word hung in the air. Annie's grandmother didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Annie, then back at the woman. We fix clothes, she said carefully. The woman nodded. Yes, but my son, he doesn't do well sitting still. His teacher says he needs something, hands-on. The boy's grip tightened around his mother's fingers. Annie slid off her stool and walked over. She looked at him openly. Do you like strings? She asked. The boy blinked. What kind? All kinds, Annie said. The kind you pull, the kind you tie, the kind you mess up and fix again. The boy considered that. Maybe. The woman smiled, hopeful and afraid at the same time. We're not a program, Annie's grandmother said gently. Not yet. The woman nodded, disappointment flickering across her face. I understand. After they left, Annie sat quietly at the table. You weren't wrong, her grandmother said. But you were kind. Annie shrugged. He looked like he needed to learn something with his hands. Yes, her grandmother agreed. And so do we. That afternoon, the black sedan came back. It parked closer this time, not hiding, but not announcing itself either. The man stepped out alone. No Richard. No folder. Just him. Annie saw him first and felt something twist in her stomach, not fear. Exactly. Anticipation. He's here, she said. Her grandmother wiped her hands on her apron. Then let him come in. He did. Good afternoon, he said, quieter than before. Afternoon, the grandmother replied. He looked at Annie. I hope I'm not interrupting. Annie shook her head. We were just thinking. He smiled faintly. That seems to be something you do well. He didn't sit this time. He stood near the table, careful not to crowd it. I won't stay, he said. I just wanted to tell you something myself. The grandmother folded her arms. We're listening. I've said no, he began. Annie's eyebrows lifted. No to what? To a lot of things, he said. Publicity. Fast timelines. People who want to turn this into something shiny. The grandmother's posture eased, just a fraction. I told them, he continued, that if this becomes about me, it fails. Annie tilted her head. Then what is it about? He met her gaze. Learning to wait, learning to see. She thought about that. You're still learning. Yes, he said. And I'm not very good at it yet. Her grandmother studied him closely. Then why come back? He hesitated. Because someone asked me why I cared. And? The grandmother prompted. And I didn't have a good answer, he admitted. Not one that felt true. Annie climbed onto her stool. My grandma says if you don't know why you're doing something, you shouldn't do it fast. He laughed softly. She's wise. She is, Annie agreed. He looked around the shop, the worn table, the shelves of thread, the quiet dignity of a place that had survived without asking permission. I care, he said slowly, because I saw something here that I don't see where I come from. What? Annie asked. Attention, he replied. Care without an audience. The grandmother nodded. That's because we don't perform. He exhaled. Exactly. Outside, a group of teenagers passed by, laughing loudly. One of them glanced in the window, then kept walking. I'm not here to push, the man said. I just want you to know you're not alone in this, even if you say no. Annie looked at him carefully. People say that a lot. They don't always mean it. He nodded. That's fair. He reached into his pocket, then stopped himself. His hand came out empty. I'll keep my distance, he said. Unless you ask otherwise. The grandmother inclined her head. That's the right answer. When he turned to leave, Annie spoke up. Hey! He paused. If kids come, she said, choosing her words carefully, they have to learn slow, and they have to be allowed to mess up. He smiled, something like relief crossing his face. I wouldn't know any other way. After he left, the shop felt full of unsaid things. That evening, Annie's grandmother made cornbread for dinner, the kind her daughter used to like. They ate quietly. Grandma? Annie asked. Yes, baby. Are we being brave? Her grandmother reached over and squeezed her hand. No, she said. We're being careful. Annie thought about the boy with the strings, about the man who was learning to wait. I think careful can be brave too, she said. Her grandmother smiled. I think you're right. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. Somewhere beyond the block, plans were being rewritten. Timelines slowed. Decisions reconsidered. Inside the shop, the sewing table stood ready. The first child arrived on a Tuesday. Not announced, not scheduled, just a knock at the door that came a little too hesitant to belong to someone certain they were welcome. Annie heard it before her grandmother did. She slid off her stool and opened the door a crack. The boy from Saturday stood there with his mother. Both of them dressed carefully, like they were going somewhere important and didn't want to mess it up. We didn't know if today was okay, the woman said quickly. If not, we can come back. Annie looked at the boy. He was holding a shoelace in his hands, twisting it until it knotted itself. "It's okay," Annie said. She opened the door wider. "We're open." Her grandmother appeared behind her, took in the scene, and sighed, not tired, not annoyed, just aware that a line had been crossed and couldn't be uncrossed. "Come in," she said. "But we start slow." The boy nodded hard, relief flooding his face. They didn't call it a class. They didn't even call it teaching. Annie showed him how to thread a needle using a piece of yarn and a plastic eye, the way her grandmother had once shown her. The boy struggled, missed, dropped it, picked it up again. His mother hovered near the door, unsure where to stand. "Sit," Annie told her, pointing to the chair. "He needs to mess up." The woman laughed softly and sat. By the end of the hour, the boy had stitched 3 crooked lines into a scrap of fabric and smiled like he'd built something that mattered. Word spread faster after that. Not loudly, not online. It spread the way things always had in that neighborhood, through conversations at bus stops, through aunties on porches, through parents who'd tried everything else and were tired of watching their kids be told they didn't fit. By Friday, 2 more children showed up. Annie's grandmother watched them closely, her rules firm but fair. No rushing, no phones, no pretending you know something you don't. The children listened. Annie taught them how to pull thread tight without snapping it, how to unpick a seam without tearing the cloth, how to start over without shame. "These are fixing rules," she told them seriously. "They work for everything." On Friday afternoon, the man stood across the street again. This time, he didn't come in. He watched through the window as Annie knelt beside a table too big for her, patiently guiding a child's hands. He saw the grandmother correcting posture, not with criticism, but with a tap and a nod. He saw the mother in the corner, eyes wet, watching her son focus for the first time all week. Richard stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "They didn't ask permission," Richard said quietly. "No," the man replied. "They shouldn't have to. You know this changes things," Richard added. "Yes," he said, "and that's why we wait." Inside, Annie glanced up and saw him standing there. She froze for a second, then went back to what she was doing. Later that evening, after the children had left and the shop was quiet again, Annie finally spoke. "He watched," she said. Her grandmother nodded. "I saw. He didn't come in." "That's good." Annie frowned. "Why?" "Because if he had," her grandmother said, "some people would have started behaving for him instead of for the work." Annie thought about that. That would make it fake. Yes. The following week brought the first problem. A woman from the city came by unannounced. Clipboard. Bright smile. Questions that didn't belong to anyone who intended to listen. "We've had reports," she said, "about children working in a commercial space." Annie's grandmother folded her arms. "They're learning." "Is there a permit?" the woman asked. "For what?" the grandmother replied. Sitting, the woman's smile tightened. "We just want to make sure everyone's safe." "They are," Annie said quietly. The woman looked down at her, surprised. "And you are?" "Annie." "Well, Annie," the woman said, softening her voice in a way that didn't feel soft at all. "Rules exist for a reason." Annie met her gaze. "So do people." The woman blinked. By the time she left, promising to follow up, the shop felt colder. That night, Annie's grandmother locked the door earlier than usual. "Is she going to stop us?" Annie asked. Her grandmother took a long moment before answering. "She might try." Annie nodded, absorbing that without panic. "Do we stop then?" "No," her grandmother said. "We get careful." Across town, the man listened to Richard recount the visit. "She didn't shut them down," Richard said, "but she planted a flag." The man leaned back, jaw tight. "Then we do nothing." Richard hesitated. "Nothing? Nothing visible," the man corrected. "This doesn't get solved with pressure, or calls, or favors." Richard frowned. "That's not how it usually works." "I know," the man said. "That's the problem." He thought of Annie's voice. Calm, unafraid, unimpressed. "I won't protect them by standing in front," he said. "I'll protect them by standing back." On Saturday, more children came. Annie taught them all the same way, slow, patient, exacting. She corrected gently, praised honestly, never raised her voice. When one boy grew frustrated and pushed his chair back, Annie didn't scold him. "Your hands are tired," she said. "That's okay. Rest them." He stared at her, then sat back down. By the end of the day, Annie's fingers ached. Her grandmother made soup and insisted she soak her hands in warm water. "You did good work," she said. Annie shrugged. They did too. Outside, the street hummed with the low sound of something forming. Not a movement, not yet, just attention. Quiet, careful attention. The man drove past once more that evening, slower than before. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. Inside the shop, Annie practiced stitches long after the sun went down. Some things, once started, asked to be finished the right way. The notice came folded, not sealed. It was slipped halfway under the door early Monday morning, the paper bent at the corner like it had already decided where it belonged. Annie found it when she unlocked the shop, the bell ringing once before she noticed the white edge against the dark floor. She picked it up carefully, as if it might bite. "Grandma," she said. Her grandmother came over, took the paper, and read it without changing her expression. That worried Annie more than if she'd frowned. "What is it?" Annie asked. "Someone wants us to explain ourselves," her grandmother said. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," she replied. Which is usually when explanations are most dangerous. The notice wasn't a shutdown order. Not yet. It was an inspection request. Zoning, safety, compliance. Words that sounded harmless until you'd lived long enough to know how they could be used. Annie climbed onto her stool and watched her grandmother fold the paper again, neat and exact. "Are they coming today?" Annie asked. "Tomorrow," her grandmother said. "Which means today we don't change anything." "But, no," she said gently. "We don't hide good work." Annie nodded, though her stomach tightened. By midday, the shop was full, not crowded. Full. 3 children at the table, 2 mothers sitting quietly along the wall. The hum of voices, low, careful. Everyone sensed something was coming, even if they didn't know what. Annie taught as she always did. She showed a girl how to keep her stitches even by breathing slowly. She reminded a boy not to pull the thread too tight or it would pucker the cloth. She corrected mistakes without naming them as such. "This part didn't listen," she'd say. "So we try again." Outside, a city truck passed slowly, the seal on the door bright against the dull street. Annie watched it go, her fingers missing the needle's eye for the first time all day. Across town, the man sat with his hands folded, listening. "They're moving faster than expected," Richard said, pacing the length of the room. "Inspection usually takes weeks." The man didn't respond right away. He stared at the window, at the city below moving at its usual indifferent pace. "They feel watched," he said finally. "By whom? By something they don't control." Richard stopped pacing. "You, AGT7. "No," the man replied. "By change." Richard exhaled. "We can intervene." The man turned. "And do what?" "Delay, reroute, make a call, and teach them what lesson?" he asked. "That safety depends on who you know." Richard hesitated. The man continued, quieter now. "If this works, it has to work without me leaning on it. And if it doesn't, then we learn something harder." Richard didn't like that answer, but he nodded. Back at the shop, the inspection became the only thing anyone talked about. "They'll shut you down," one woman whispered as she paid for a hem. "They always do." "They'll find something," said another. "They always do." Annie listened, quiet. That evening, after everyone left, Annie sat at the table long after the lights were dimmed. "Grandma?" she asked. "Yes, baby. Why do people think rules only matter when they want them to?" Her grandmother sat across from her. "Because rules make some people feel safe and other people feel small." Annie frowned. "Which are we?" Her grandmother reached across the table and took her hand. "We're careful," she said again. "And careful people last." The next morning, the inspector arrived on time. She was younger than Annie expected. Early 30s, maybe. Hair pulled tight, clipboard held like a shield. Her shoes were sensible. Her expression practiced. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," the grandmother replied. I'm here to conduct a routine inspection. We were expecting you. The inspector glanced around, her eyes landing on the children, the sewing table, the extra chairs. This is a commercial space, she said. Yes. And these are minors. Yes. Are they employees? No, the grandmother said. They're learners. The inspector made a note. Do you have a permit for instruction? We don't instruct, Annie said before her grandmother could stop her. The inspector looked down. Excuse me. Annie met her gaze. We show. A flicker of irritation crossed the woman's face. There's a difference. Yes, Annie agreed. Instruction tells. Showing lets people try. The inspector stared at her for a moment longer than necessary. I'll speak with the adult, she said. I am the adult, the grandmother replied calmly. They walked the space together. Measured distances. Checked outlets. Counted chairs. The inspector's pen scratched across the clipboard. And safety training? She asked. Annie raised her hand. We don't run. The inspector looked surprised. And we don't rush, Annie continued. And we put the needles away when we're done. The grandmother watched the inspector closely now, reading the small sign's tight jaw, the way her grip shifted on the clipboard. You can't just decide what's safe, the inspector said. No, the grandmother agreed. But we can decide what's careful. The inspection ended without incident. No citations, no orders, just a promise to review the situation. After the door closed, the shop exhaled as one. Annie climbed onto her stool, her hands shaking just a little. Was that bad? She asked. Her grandmother smiled. No, that was the middle. Across town, Richard relayed the outcome. They didn't shut them down, he said. But they're watching. The man nodded. Good. Good? Richard repeated. Yes, he said. Watching means they can't pretend they didn't see. Dual exampses. That night, Annie dreamed of thread unraveling and being tied back together. She woke with her hands curled into fists. The next morning, more children came. One brought her little brother. Another brought a friend. No one announced it. They just arrived, hopeful and quiet. Annie didn't turn anyone away. She taught them to wait their turn, to listen, to fix what came undone. Outside, the street looked the same as it always had. Inside, something was holding. By the time the second notice came, Annie could tell something was different before she even read it. The paper was thicker this time. Official. It didn't bend when she picked it up. It resisted her fingers, like it wanted to be taken seriously. Her grandmother read it standing up. That's new, she said. Annie swallowed. Is it bad? It's heavier. Her grandmother replied. That doesn't always mean worse. It means someone higher up wants to be sure. Sure of what? That they're right. We're cladding. The notice wasn't an inspection request. It was an invitation, if such a thing could be called that. A meeting. Downtown. City offices. 2 days from now. Annie climbed onto her stool and hugged her knees. Do we have to go? Her grandmother folded the paper once, then again. When people ask you to explain yourself, refusing is the same as letting them explain you instead. Annie thought about the inspector's clipboard, about the way the woman's pen had scratched harder when Annie spoke. Can I come? She asked. Her grandmother looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. But you'll listen more than you talk. I always do, Annie replied. Across town, the man read the same notice on a tablet screen, his jaw tightening as he reached the last line. They're moving it to a committee, Richard said. Education, zoning, youth services. The man exhaled slowly. They're trying to decide what to call it. Richard nodded. Names make things manageable. Or disposable, the man said. You want to attend? Richard asked. No, he replied immediately. That would make it about me. Richard hesitated. What if they push? They will, the man said. And Annie's grandmother will hold. The day before the meeting, the shop was unusually quiet. Parents still came. Children still stitched. But the laughter was lower. The movements more careful. Everyone felt the pause in the air. The moment before something tipped one way or another. Annie helped a girl named Lila unpick a crooked seam. Does it hurt when you undo it? Lila asked. Annie shook her head. Only if you're mad at it. What if it doesn't work again? Then we try again, Annie said. That's how fixing goes. That night, Annie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, to her grandmother's slow breathing in the next room. The city outside hummed with distant sirens and passing cars. She imagined the downtown building, big rooms, shiny floors, people who talked like they were always in a hurry. She curled her fingers into the blanket, pretending it was fabric. The meeting room was colder than Annie expected. Too much air conditioning, too much space. The table was long and polished. Chairs lined up on either side like they were waiting for a performance. 3 people sat on one side, 2 on the other. Annie and her grandmother took their seats together. A woman at the center of the table smiled tightly. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We just want to understand what's happening in your shop." "We fix clothes," the grandmother replied. A man to the woman's left cleared his throat. "We've received reports of minors participating in regular activities on the premises. They learn," the grandmother said. "They're not employees." "And there's no fee?" another voice asked. "No," she replied. The woman nodded, writing something down. "So this is informal instruction?" Annie shifted in her chair. "It's showing," she said. The room went still. The woman looked down at her. "Excuse me?" "We show," Annie repeated. "We don't tell them what to be. We let them try." A murmur rippled across the table. The man frowned. "And who supervises?" "My grandma," Annie said. "And me." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You?" Annie nodded. "I know where the needles go." "Ohs." Her grandmother placed a hand on Annie's arm not to stop her, but to steady her. "We've been here for decades," the grandmother said. "This shop existed before programs, before permits. We've kept people warm, employed, dignified. This is no different." A man at the end of the table leaned forward. "It is different," he said. "Because now you're visible." The grandmother met his gaze. "We've always been visible. You're just finally looking." Silence followed. The woman closed her folder. "We're not here to shut you down," she said. "We're here to make sure children are safe." "They are," Annie said quietly. "And what about liability?" another asked. The grandmother answered calmly. "We teach care. That's the first safety." The meeting ended without a decision. They would review. They would consider options. They would be in touch. When Annie and her grandmother stepped back outside, the sun felt too bright. Annie let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Was that bad? Her grandmother smiled faintly. No. That was the beginning of them listening. Across town, the man waited for Richard's call. "They didn't stop it," Richard said when he finally spoke. "But they want to name it. Regulate it." "And?" the man asked. "And once they name it, they own it." The man closed his eyes. "Then we make sure the name fits." "How?" "By staying patient," he said. "And by letting the work speak." That evening, the shop filled again. Children stitched. Parents watched. Someone brought lemonade. Someone else swept without being asked. Annie sat at the table, her hands steady now. She looked around at the quiet order of it all and understood something new. Fixing didn't always mean making something stronger right away. Sometimes it meant holding it together long enough for others to see what it already was. The vote was supposed to be quiet. That was how the city framed it later: an administrative decision, a procedural adjustment, a line added to a handbook no one read unless they had to. No cameras, no public hearing, just a committee room, a short agenda, and a choice that would decide whether the shop remained what it was or became something easier to manage. Annie didn't know about the vote when she woke up that morning. She knew about the loose button on her grandmother's coat and fixed it before breakfast. She knew about the boy who'd been practicing straight seams for 3 weeks and still pulled the thread too tight. She knew about the way the shop felt different when adults talked quietly in corners, like the walls themselves were listening. By 10 o'clock, the room was full. Children at the table, parents along the wall. Someone had brought a box of donuts and set it near the register. Untouched, the radio hummed low, a familiar song about work and waiting. Annie stitched. Her grandmother stood behind her, hands folded, eyes on the door. Downtown, the committee gathered. 3 departments, 7 people. One item on the agenda labeled Community Activity, Unpermitted Instruction. They talked about safety, about liability, about consistency. Someone said, "If we allow this, we have to allow others." Someone else replied, "Others aren't doing this." Yes. A third voice cut in, sharp and impatient. "That's not the point. The point, though no one said it out loud, was control." Across town, the man sat alone, hands flat on his desk, phone turned face down. He'd been invited to attend as an observer. He'd declined. Twice. Richard stood by the window, watching traffic. "They'll fold it into a pilot," Richard said. "Temporary approval, conditions, oversight." The man didn't look up. "And when the pilot ends, they'll decide whether it worked." The man nodded once, or whether it behaved. At the shop, the bell rang. Annie looked up, expecting another child. Instead, a woman stepped inside wearing a city badge clipped to her jacket. Not the inspector from before. Older, calmer. Tired in a way that came from too many meetings and not enough results. She didn't speak right away. She looked at the room, at the children stitching, at the mothers watching, at the grandmother who didn't flinch. "I'm here to observe," the woman said finally. Annie's grandmother nodded. "You're welcome to sit," the woman did. She watched quietly for a long time. Watched Annie show a girl how to unpick a seam without tearing it. Watched a boy calm himself by counting stitches. Watched parents soften as their children focused. At one point, the woman leaned toward Annie. "How old are you?" "6, Annie replied without looking up. "And you teach?" Annie shook her head. "I show." The woman smiled faintly. "Of course you do." Downtown, the vote was called. 4-3, conditional approval, temporary, with requirements, oversight visits, documentation, a framework that would make the work legible to people who didn't know how to read it. At the shop, the woman stood. "I've seen enough," she said. Annie's grandmother rose as well. "And?" The woman hesitated. "This isn't how programs usually look." "No," the grandmother said. "It's how care looks." The woman nodded slowly. "You'll be hearing from us." After she left, the room exhaled. Annie felt it in her shoulders. "Is that good?" a boy asked. Annie thought about the word. "It's not bad," she said. "That's something." That afternoon, the man drove past again. This time, he didn't slow. He didn't need to. Richard's call came an hour later. "They approved it," Richard said. "With conditions." The man closed his eyes. "Temporary?" "Yes." "And oversight?" "Yes." The man exhaled. "Then we keep waiting." Richard hesitated. "You know, this puts pressure on them. Documentation. Reports. It changes the rhythm." "I know," the man said. "Which is why we don't rush to fix it." At sunset, the shop closed early. Annie and her grandmother sat at the table together. The proposal still beneath the thimble paperweight. The city notice folded beside it. "Are we okay?" Annie asked. Her grandmother reached over and took her hand. "We're holding," she said. "That's the work right now." Annie nodded. She picked up a needle and threaded it without looking. Somewhere downtown, a decision had been made that would take years to understand. In the shop, the work continued, steady and quiet. The conditions arrived by email. They came as a list of bullet points written in careful language, the kind meant to sound reasonable even when it asked for too much. Attendance logs, weekly summaries, safety acknowledgments signed by parents, a name for what the shop was now doing. Program. Annie read the word upside down from across the table. "It sounds like television," she said. Her grandmother smiled without humor. "It sounds like something they can file." They didn't print the email right away. They let it sit on the screen while the shop opened for the day. Children arrived, quieter than usual, as if they could sense the weight of words they hadn't read. Annie noticed how differently people moved now. Parents asked permission before sitting. Children raised their hands before speaking. Someone asked where the sign-in sheet was. Annie frowned. "Why are you waiting?" she asked a boy holding a needle midair. "I don't want to do it wrong," he said. Annie reached over and gently lowered his hand. "You're allowed to try," she said. "That's the rule that doesn't change." Her grandmother watched this closely. By noon, she closed the shop for lunch. That alone caused confusion. People stood outside with sandwiches in hand, unsure whether to leave or wait. The rhythm had shifted, and no one liked it. Inside, Annie's grandmother printed the email and laid it on the table. Now, she said. We read, I asked. They went through it line by line. Some things were reasonable. Fire exits, first aid kits, clear walkways. Other things were heavier. Adult-to-child ratios, Annie read slowly. But I'm a child. Her grandmother nodded. That's where they get nervous. They don't trust me, Annie said. They don't know you, her grandmother replied. There's a difference. Annie considered that. Can they learn? Yes, her grandmother said, but like everything else, not fast. Where there canna, across town, the man read the same conditions. Richard stood nearby, already outlining responses, alternatives, revisions. We can negotiate some of this, Richard said. Clarify language. Adjust expectations. The man shook his head. Not yet. Why not? Because they're watching to see how we react, he said. If we push now, they'll assume we're hiding something. Richard frowned. And if we don't? Then they'll have to look closer, the man replied, at what's actually happening. Back at the shop, Annie helped her grandmother tape a blank sheet of paper to the wall. What's that for? Annie asked. To name things ourselves, her grandmother said. She wrote at the top in neat, steady handwriting, rules that matter. Underneath, Annie added the first line, carefully sounding out each word as she wrote. Go slow. The children gathered around. Another child raised a hand. Can I add one? Annie nodded. If it matters. 2. The boy wrote, crooked but proud. Fix what you break. A girl stepped forward next. Ask before you help. Soon the page filled not with regulations, but with understanding. The grandmother watched, her chest tightening with something like grief and pride mixed together. That afternoon, the woman from the committee returned. No clipboard this time. No badge visible. She stood near the door, watching. Annie noticed her and kept stitching. After a while, the woman spoke. I've been reading your file. Her grandmother didn't look up. We don't have a file. The woman smiled faintly. Everyone has a file. She stepped closer to the wall with the handwritten rules. This isn't standard, she said. No, the grandmother agreed. But it works, the woman said quietly. Annie looked up. Does it have to be standard? The woman met her gaze. That depends on who you ask. And who are you asking? Annie pressed. The woman hesitated. I'm trying to ask myself. Oh, she stayed for an hour. No notes, no questions. When she left, she paused at the door. Be careful, she said. They'll want data. Annie tilted her head. We have stitches. The woman smiled sadly. I wish that were enough. That night, Annie's grandmother cooked greens the way her daughter used to slow, with vinegar and patience. They ate quietly. Grandma, Annie said, are we changing? Her grandmother considered the question. Yes, she said. But we're choosing how. Annie nodded. Okay. The next week brought forms. Parents filled them out carefully. Some hesitated. Some asked questions. Some thanked Annie as if she were older than she was. Annie didn't like that. Don't thank me for waiting, she told one mother. You do it too. The mother blinked, then smiled. The shop kept going. Oversight visits came and went. People observed. Took notes. Asked fewer questions each time. The man never came in. He watched from a distance. His patience tested daily by instincts honed over decades. Nothing is breaking, Richard reported one evening. That's because they're not pulling too hard yet, the man replied. He thought of Annie's hands. Small, steady, unafraid. At the end of the month, another email arrived. Shorter this time. Acknowledging compliance. Commending community engagement. Extending approval. Temporary became provisional. Provisional wasn't permanent, but it wasn't fragile either. Annie taped the new notice next to the handwritten rules. Does this mean we win? A child asked. Annie shook her head. It means we keep going. That night, Annie dreamed of fabric laid out across a long table. People on every side holding it steady. No one pulled. No one rushed. In the morning, she woke ready to stitch again. By the time the provisional status settled into routine, Annie could feel the difference in her hands. Not pain, awareness. Every stitch mattered more now, not because the work had changed, but because eyes had learned how to look. The shop no longer felt invisible. and that came with a weight Annie hadn't expected. Being seen meant being measured. Being measured meant someone, somewhere, would decide what counted. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Annie sat alone at the table, practicing blind stitching the way her grandmother had taught her, eyes closed, fingers listening. She liked the exercise. It reminded her that work didn't always need watching to be true. The bell rang. Annie opened her eyes. The man stood in the doorway. He looked different this time. No jacket, no vest, just a plain shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He hesitated, as if stepping across the threshold required permission he wasn't sure he still had. Annie slid off her stool. "You're early," she said. He smiled faintly. "I didn't want to be late." Her grandmother appeared from the back, took one look at him, and nodded once. "You can come in." He did. The shop was quiet, no children, no parents. Just the hum of the old sewing machine cooling down. "I didn't come to talk business," he said quickly, "or conditions, or oversight." "Eco." Annie tilted her head. "Then, why?" "Because I needed to see it," he replied. Without an audience. Her grandmother gestured to a chair. "Sit." He sat, hands folded loosely in his lap. Not the posture of a man about to negotiate. The posture of someone waiting to be told what was appropriate. "I've been reading the reports," he said. "The summaries. The observations. And?" the grandmother asked. "They don't know how to write what's happening here," he admitted. Annie smiled a little. "That's because it's not words." He nodded. "That's what I wanted to say to you." Annie climbed back onto her stool and picked up her needle. "Say it." He took a breath. "I'm used to fixing problems by naming them," he said. "By defining them until they behave." "And does it work?" Annie asked. "Sometimes," he said. "But it breaks things too." Her grandmother watched him closely. "You didn't come here to confess." "No," he said. "I came to ask something, and to accept no if that's the answer." Annie's needle paused. "I want to fund this," he said carefully. "Not through the city. Not through a program. Quietly. Tools. Repairs. Nothing that changes how it works." Annie frowned. "That sounds like ownership." "It isn't," he said quickly. "It's distance. I don't want my name on anything." Her grandmother folded her arms. "Money always has a voice." "Yes," he agreed. "That's why I'm asking permission before it speaks." "Risn't." Annie looked at her grandmother, then back at him. "What happens if we say no?" "Then I leave it alone," he said. "Completely. And if we say yes, then I listen," he replied. "And I don't interfere." The room went quiet. Annie threaded her needle again, slow and careful. "My grandma says fixing something wrong makes it worse." He smiled. "She's right." Her grandmother sighed. "You want to help because it changed you." "Yes. Here. And because you don't want it to change back," she added. He didn't deny it. Annie spoke softly. "If you help, you don't get to decide when it's enough." He nodded. "I know. And you don't get to stop waiting," she continued. A hint of emotion crossed his face. "I don't want to." Her grandmother closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her voice was steady. "We'll think about it." He stood immediately. "That's all I ask." At the door, he paused. "Annie?" "Yes. Thank you," he said. "For not letting me rush." She nodded. "You're learning." After he left, the shop felt fuller somehow. That evening, the first article appeared. It wasn't loud. Not viral. Just a small feature buried in the local paper about an unconventional neighborhood initiative. No names, no photos of Annie, just a description of children learning patience with their hands. The next day, 2 new families came. The day after that, 3 more. And with them came something else. Expectation. Parents asked how long their children could stay. Whether there were certificates, outcomes, proof. Annie listened, then answered the same way every time. "They'll learn to wait," she said, "and to fix things they break." Some nodded, some didn't come back. That night, Annie sat with her grandmother at the kitchen table, forms spread out between them. "Are we losing it?" Annie asked quietly. Her grandmother shook her head. "We're finding the edges." Annie traced a finger along the paper. "Edges tear." "Yes, her grandmother said. Unless you reinforce them, Annie smiled faintly. With better thread. Across town, the man stared at the city lights from his office window. They didn't say yes, Richard said. They didn't say no, the man replied. Richard hesitated. You okay with that? The man nodded slowly. It means they're protecting it. He thought of Annie's hands, of the way she'd spoken without fear. For the first time in a long time, he felt grateful for not being in control. Back at the shop, Annie practiced a new stitch, one meant to hold under strain. It wasn't pretty, but it lasted. The answer came without a signature. No letterhead, no announcement. Just a quiet deposit into the shop's account on a Monday morning. Small enough not to draw attention, steady enough to matter. The description line read only, "For repairs." Annie's grandmother noticed it first. She stared at the screen for a long time, reading the number twice, then closing the laptop without saying a word. Annie watched her carefully. Is it bad? Her grandmother shook her head. No, is it good? It's careful, she said, which means someone listened. They didn't talk about it again that day. Instead, they fixed the back step that had been loose for months, replaced a flickering light above the table, bought 3 new spools of thread, the kind that didn't snap when pulled hard. Nothing flashy, nothing visible from the street. The work went on, but people noticed anyway. The shop felt steadier, quieter, like something had been reinforced beneath the surface. Children sensed it first. Their shoulders relaxed. Their hands stopped shaking so much when they made mistakes. Annie noticed too. She noticed that when a stitch went wrong, she didn't panic. She unpicked it calmly, trusting she'd have enough thread to try again. On Wednesday, the woman from the committee returned. No badge, no clipboard, just a coffee cup in her hand and a look that suggested she'd come before she'd decided why. I won't stay, she said. Her grandmother nodded. That's usually how it starts. The woman smiled ruefully. I wanted to see if anything had changed. Annie looked around. It's still here. Yes, the woman said. That's what surprised me. She stayed anyway. Watched a boy fix the hem he'd messed up himself. Watched a girl teach another girl how to knot thread without tangling it. This isn't scaling, the woman said quietly. No, the grandmother replied. It's holding. The woman took a sip of her coffee. Holding isn't something we know how to fund. Annie looked up. Then don't. The woman laughed, startled. I don't think that's up to me. Annie shrugged. It's always up to someone. After she left, the shop felt watched again, but differently now. Not hunted. Measured. Considered. That afternoon, a man in a suit came in with a jacket over his arm. I was told this was the place, he said. For what? Annie asked. He hesitated. For fixing things without asking too many questions. It is not it. Her grandmother smiled faintly. You heard right. The man's jacket had been torn at the elbow, the fabric worn thin. Annie ran her fingers along it, feeling the weakness. This won't look new, she said. That's okay, he replied. I don't need it to. She nodded and began. As she worked, the man watched quietly. You're the girl everyone's talking about, he said. Annie didn't look up. People talk too much, he chuckled. That's true. He paid, thanked her grandmother, and left without another word. By Friday, the account had another small deposit, then another the following week. Always the same description. For repairs, the man didn't come back. That mattered. Across town, Richard watched the numbers accumulate and frowned. He's doing exactly what he said he would, Richard said. Nothing visible. The man nodded. Good. You could do more. Yes, he agreed. Which is why I won't. Richard studied him. You've changed. The man thought of Annie's hands, steady and unafraid. I'm learning to wait. Richard smiled. You're terrible at it. Yes, the man said, but I'm trying. At the shop, a problem finally surfaced. 2 parents argued quietly near the door about whose child should get more time at the table. Voices stayed low, but tension spread like a pulled thread. Annie noticed immediately. She set down her needle and walked over. We take turns, she said. My son needs more help, one parent insisted. So does mine, the other replied. Annie looked between them. Then you both wait. They stared at her. Waiting isn't punishment, she added. It's part of learning. The parents fell silent, embarrassed. Her grandmother watched from across the room, pride tightening her chest. That night, Annie asked a question she'd been holding. Grandma? Yes, baby. Are we becoming something else? Her grandmother considered it. We're becoming clearer. Annie frowned. Clear things break easier. Yes, her grandmother said. Which is why they have to be honest. On Sunday, a letter arrived. This one was official, permanent approval, with conditions, still but fewer. Less oversight. Trust, written carefully into policy language. Annie traced the words with her finger. What does permanent mean? She asked. It means they've decided we're worth the trouble. Her grandmother replied. Annie smiled faintly. We always were. That evening, the man drove past again. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. The shop glowed warm against the darkening street. Children laughed softly inside. The sewing machine hummed, steady and familiar. He felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, completion, back inside. Annie practiced a new stitch, one meant for edges that frayed easily. She took her time. Somewhere, systems adjusted. Policies changed. Credit was claimed by people who hadn't held a needle in their lives. But in the shop, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the work held. By the time autumn arrived, the shop had learned a new sound. Not the hum of the sewing machine. Not the bell over the door. This sound was quieter paper being handled carefully. Forms signed without anxiety. Notices read without dread. Permanence had changed the air, not by making it lighter, but by making it steadier. Annie felt it most in the mornings. She no longer woke with the tightness in her chest that came from wondering if today would be the day someone told them to stop. The work waited for her now, patient and dependable. Like fabric laid flat before the first cut. On the first cool morning of October, Annie arrived early and opened the shop herself. She liked turning the key, liked the small authority of it. Her grandmother watched from the doorway. You don't rush opening, she said. I know, Annie replied. I listen first. She stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet before the city woke up. Then she flipped the sign. By 10 o'clock, the tables were full. Not crowded, never crowded, but full in the way a place becomes when people trust it. Children stitched. Parents spoke softly. Someone swept the floor without being asked. A new boy sat near the edge of the table, hands folded tightly in his lap. He hadn't touched a needle yet, Annie noticed. She slid her stool closer. You don't have to start, she said. I don't know how. He replied. That's okay, Annie said. Neither do the needles. They just wait. He looked at her, confused. She placed a needle on the table between them. See? It's not doing anything. The boy smiled, just a little. That afternoon, the man returned. This time, he didn't stand across the street. He didn't linger by the window. He came in like anyone else, quietly, without expectation. Annie saw him and felt something warm and familiar, like recognizing a stitch pattern you hadn't seen in a while. You came back, she said. Yes, he replied. I was invited. Her grandmother nodded. You were. He took in the room. The changes so subtle they'd be invisible to anyone who hadn't been paying attention. New thread. Reinforced table legs. The wall of rules. Now neatly copied and framed. They kept your words, he said. They weren't just words, Annie replied. He smiled. No, they weren't. He didn't stay long. He watched for a while, asked no questions, offered nothing. When he stood to leave, he paused by the table. You did this without me, he said quietly. Annie looked up. You waited. Yes, he said. And it worked. Her grandmother met his eyes. It didn't need you, she said. But it didn't reject you either. He nodded, accepting that truth without flinching. At the door, he hesitated. I'm stepping back, he said. Completely. Annie tilted her head. You already did. He smiled, relieved. After he left, Annie returned to her work without ceremony. That night, the first real conflict arrived. A parent filed a complaint. Not loud, not angry, just formal enough to matter. They claimed their child wasn't progressing fast enough, that others were receiving more attention, that the shop wasn't delivering results. Annie read the words slowly, sounding them out in her head. Results, she said. Her grandmother sighed. It always comes back to that. What do we do? Annie asked. We listen, her grandmother replied. Then we decide what not to change. The parent was invited in the next day. They sat stiffly, arms crossed, eyes darting around the room as if measuring value. My son needs structure, the parent said. Benchmarks. Annie listened. Her grandmother responded calmly. He's learning patience, control, how to fix mistakes. That doesn't show up on a chart, the parent replied. No, her grandmother agreed. It shows up later, the parent frowned. Later doesn't help now. What do I do? Annie spoke softly. It helped me. The parent looked down at her, surprised. How? I learned how to wait, Annie said, and how to finish things. Silence followed. The parent exhaled. I just don't want him left behind, Annie nodded. Neither do we. They didn't promise anything. They didn't argue. The parent left quieter than they arrived. The complaint was closed without escalation. That mattered too. Weeks passed. Winter crept in, slow and gray. The shop grew warmer, fuller. Scarves and coats replaced hems and sleeves. Annie's fingers grew faster, surer. She began teaching younger children how to teach each other. Showing isn't doing it for them, she reminded them. It's helping them try. Her grandmother watched, saying less now, trusting more. One evening, as snow threatened but didn't fall, Annie stayed late to finish a repair. The shop was empty except for her and the soft glow of the lamp. She held a jacket up to the light, checking her work. Perfect, she smiled. For the first time, she felt something settled deep inside her, not pride. Exactly. Ownership. Not of the shop, not of the work, of the way she did things. Her grandmother came down the stairs and stood beside her. You're growing into it, she said. Into what? Annie asked. Into someone who knows when to hold and when to let go. Annie thought about the man, about the city, about the rules that mattered and the ones that didn't. I think fixing things isn't about control, she said slowly. Her grandmother smiled. What is it about? Care, Annie replied. And not quitting. Her grandmother reached for her hand. That's the hardest part. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one. The shop glowed warm against the cold. Nothing dramatic happened that night. No announcements, no headlines, no turning points. Just work done well. Which, Annie had learned, was how the biggest changes always began. Winter arrived the way it always did without asking. The cold settled into the cracks of the sidewalk and pressed against the shop windows, turning the glass faintly opaque in the early mornings. Annie learned to recognize the sound of it before she felt it. The quieter street, the slower footsteps, the pause people took before opening the door. Inside, the shop grew warmer. Scarves piled up on the counter. Coats with worn elbows waited patiently on hooks. Gloves appeared in pairs that never quite matched. The work changed with the season. Heavier fabric, thicker thread, stitches that needed more strength than speed. Annie liked winter work. It demanded attention. One afternoon, as light snow began to fall, a man came in carrying a coat that looked older than Annie's grandmother. I don't want it replaced, he said before anyone could ask. Just fixed enough to last. Annie ran her fingers along the lining, feeling where time had thinned it. It remembers things, she said. The man blinked. It does? Yes, Annie replied. You can tell by where it's worn. Her grandmother smiled quietly and handed Annie the heavier needle. As Annie worked, the man sat nearby and told stories without being prompted about a factory job long gone, about winters when work was steady and summers when it wasn't, about learning to make do without calling it sacrifice. When the coat was finished, he held it carefully. Feels like itself, he said. That's the goal, Annie replied. He paid, thanked her grandmother, and left slower than he'd arrived. Later that week, the city sent another visitor. Not oversight, not inspection. A woman from a community development office stepped in with cold hands and an uncertain smile. I've been asked to learn how this place works, she said. Annie looked up from her stitching. It works by not rushing, the woman laughed softly. I'm starting to see that. They weld. She stayed all afternoon, asking fewer questions as time passed. writing nothing down. At one point, she helped sweep the floor. When she left, she shook Annie's grandmother's hand. "Whatever this is," she said, "it's doing something right." Her grandmother nodded. "It's doing what it's meant to." Not everything went smoothly. A heater failed one morning, leaving the shop cold until noon. A shipment of thread arrived wrong too thin, snapping under tension. Two children argued so fiercely over a pair of scissors that Annie had to separate them and sit them on opposite sides of the room. "You don't fix things when you're mad," she told them. "What if I don't want to fix it?" One snapped. Annie met his eyes. "Then you wait until you do." They did. Waiting, Annie had learned, wasn't empty time. It was preparation. One evening, after the shop closed, Annie's grandmother sat at the table with a stack of old photographs. Black and white, sepia, faded at the edges. "My mother," she said, pointing. "And hers." Annie studied the faces, women with strong hands and tired eyes, standing in rooms that looked a lot like this one. "They look serious," Annie said. "They were," her grandmother replied. "They didn't have room not to be." Annie traced a finger along the edge of a photograph. Did they know what they were making? Her grandmother thought for a long time. "I think they knew what they were protecting." Tex. The next day, a letter arrived, not from the city, not from any office Annie recognized. It was handwritten. The man, he didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He thanked them for teaching him how to step back, for showing him that support didn't need direction, for reminding him that patience could be practiced like a skill. At the bottom, he wrote one line, "You fixed more than a vest." Annie read it twice, then folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beneath the table, with other things that mattered but didn't need display. That winter, the shop didn't grow bigger. It grew deeper. Children stayed longer. Parents spoke less. The work became quieter, more confident. Annie began to notice when a child was ready to teach another without being asked. "Show her," she'd say, stepping aside. And they would. On the first day of snow that actually stuck, the shop closed early. Annie and her grandmother stood at the window, watching the street soften under white. "It's going to be hard tomorrow," Annie said. "Yes," her grandmother agreed. "But it will still be here." Annie smiled. Good work always is. That night, Annie dreamed of fabric stretched across generations, hands passing needles forward without instructions. When she woke, she knew something important. Fixing wasn't just about holding things together. It was about knowing when they could hold themselves. Spring didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly. In small permissions, the door left open a little longer. Coats hung but not zipped, the light lingering just enough in the evenings that Annie forgot to turn on the lamp until her grandmother reminded her. The shop breathed differently now. Winter's wait had taught it patience. Spring brought testing. Children who had learned to wait now wanted to move faster. Parents who had learned to trust now wondered what came next. Permanence had solved one fear and awakened another. Growth. Annie felt it in her hands first. Her stitches were faster, cleaner. She caught mistakes earlier. Sometimes, she finished a repair and felt the unfamiliar itch of restlessness, like the work had ended too soon. She didn't like that feeling. One afternoon, she stopped mid-stitch and frowned. "What's wrong?" her grandmother asked. "I went too fast," Annie said. She pulled the thread free and started again without being told. Her grandmother watched, saying nothing. That same week, a letter arrived from the city. Not a warning, not a notice. An invitation. A request for Annie's grandmother to speak at a community forum about successful grassroots engagement, about best practices, about replicable models. Annie read the words slowly. "Replicable means copied," she said. Her grandmother nodded. "Yes, and if it's copied wrong, then it breaks," her grandmother replied. They sat with that. "I don't want them to turn it into rules," Annie said. "They will try," her grandmother said gently. "That's how systems learn. Do we let them?" Her grandmother met her eyes. "We let them listen. We don't let them rush." The forum was held in a bright room with folding chairs and bad coffee. Annie sat in the back, feet not touching the floor, listening as adults talked about outcomes and metrics and scale. Her grandmother spoke simply, refusing slides, refusing summaries. "We didn't build something new," she said. "We protected something old, Someone asked how many children they served. Enough, her grandmother replied. Another asked how success was measured. Her grandmother paused. By how quietly it works. There was polite laughter, some confusion, some irritation. Annie watched faces the way she watched fabric looking for strain. Afterward, a woman approached them, earnest and smiling too hard. We'd love to partner, she said. Formalize this. 18. Annie spoke before her grandmother could. Why? She asked. The woman blinked. So more people can benefit. Annie nodded. They already can. They just have to wait. The woman's smile thinned. Waiting isn't always possible. Annie looked up at her. Then they're not ready. They left early. Back at the shop. Everything felt right again. Children argued and resolved it themselves. A boy taught another how to rethread without tangling. A girl who used to quit when frustrated now unpicked a seam 3 times without complaint. Annie noticed something else too. Some children were ready to leave, not because they were bored, because they had learned what they came to learn. Letting go was harder than holding. One boy hugged Annie before he left for the last time. I know how to fix stuff now, he said proudly. Annie smiled. You always did. That night, Annie asked the question she'd been circling for months. Grandma? Yes, baby. What happens when I grow up? Her grandmother looked at her carefully. You will. Annie smiled a little. I mean, the shop. Her grandmother reached for Annie's hands, turning them over gently. This doesn't belong to a place, she said. It belongs to a way. Annie thought about the man, about the city, about the children who came and went. So I can take it with me? Yes, her grandmother said. As long as you remember what it's for. Spring deepened. Flowers appeared in cracked sidewalks. The street grew louder, livelier. The shop stayed the same. One evening, Annie found the letter from the man again, tucked beneath the table. She read it once more, then placed it back. She didn't need it anymore. The final test came quietly. A grant offer. Large, generous, conditional. It would require expansion, branding, reporting. Annie read the paperwork carefully, lips pressed tight. It would help, her grandmother said softly. A lot, but it would change us, Annie replied. Yes, her grandmother agreed. That's the price. They didn't decide right away. They waited. In the waiting, the answer became obvious. They declined. Not loudly, not proudly, just clearly. The response that came back was polite, disappointed, confused. The shop remained. On the first truly warm evening of the year, Annie stayed late alone, finishing a repair she'd insisted on doing herself. The sun dipped low, casting the room in gold. She held up the finished garment and smiled. Strong, clean, honest. She turned off the light, locked the door, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, listening to the city move around her. Somewhere, people were still trying to build things fast. Here, something had already been built the slow way. Annie walked home, hands empty, heart full. The shop closed early on the last day of spring. Not because it had to, but because Annie wanted to leave the door open a little longer afterward. To stand in the quiet and notice what remained when the work was done. She finished the final repair just after 4 o'clock. A simple hem, nothing special. She held the garment up to the light, checked the line, pressed it flat with her hands instead of the iron, the way her grandmother had taught her when the fabric didn't need heat, only respect. Satisfied, she placed it on the counter and turned off the machine. The sudden silence startled her. The shop had been alive for so long, voices, thread cutting through cloth. The soft shuffle of waiting that the quiet felt almost loud. Annie stood there, hands resting on the table, breathing it in. Her grandmother came down the stairs slowly, one step at a time. Done? She asked. Yes, Annie replied. Her grandmother looked around the room, the worn table, the framed rules on the wall, the shelf where old tools rested beside new ones. She nodded once, as if confirming something only she could see. Then let's close. They flipped the sign together. Outside, the neighborhood moved at its familiar pace. A bus hissed to a stop. Someone laughed on the corner. A car passed with the windows down, music drifting out and fading as it went. Annie sat on the front step, chin in her hands. It feels strange, she said. What does? her grandmother asked, sitting beside her, not waiting for anything. Her grandmother smiled. That's because the waiting became part of you. Annie thought about the children who had come and gone. The ones who learned to hold a needle steady. The ones who learned to stop rushing. The ones who learned they could fix something without being ashamed of breaking it first. She thought about the city officials, the forms, the approvals that eventually stopped arriving. About the way attention had slowly drifted elsewhere. Satisfied that this place behaved, she thought about the man. She hadn't seen him in months. That felt right. He didn't come back, Annie said quietly. No. Her grandmother agreed. He knew when to leave. Annie nodded. That's fixing too. Her grandmother reached for Annie's hand, squeezing it gently. You understand more than most adults ever will. Annie shrugged. They're busy. Yes, her grandmother said. That's often the problem. As dusk settled, Annie stood and unlocked the door one last time. She stepped inside alone. The shop felt different now, not empty, not full. Finished, in a way that didn't ask to be closed forever. She walked to the table and opened the drawer beneath it. Inside were small things that didn't belong anywhere else. A spare button a boy had insisted on keeping, for luck. A scrap of fabric from the first child she ever taught. The folded letter from the man. Annie took the letter out and read it again. You fixed more than a vest. She didn't smile this time. She folded it carefully and placed it back. Somewhere across town, the man stood in a different kind of quiet. He was older now, not in years, but in posture. He no longer rushed through rooms. He no longer filled silence with plans. The vest still hung in his closet. He wore it sometimes, though he no longer needed it to prove anything. The seam still held, invisible and strong. When people asked him what had changed, he gave them answers they didn't expect. A child taught me how to wait, he would say. They laughed. Then they stopped laughing. He never said her name. He didn't need to. Back at the shop, Annie turned off the final light and stepped outside, locking the door behind her. She stood there for a moment, key still in her hand. Ready? Her grandmother asked. Annie nodded. They walked home together, slow and unhurried. Summer would come next. Annie knew she wouldn't always sit at that table. She would grow, she would leave, she would carry the work somewhere else in her hands, in her voice, in the way she chose not to rush when the world told her to. The shop would remain, not as a place that needed defending, but as proof of something simple and rare. That care, done quietly, lasts. That dignity doesn't need permission. That sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is no, followed by the patience to let that no become something better. Annie didn't look back as they turned the corner. She didn't need to. The work was finished, and it would continue. The story reminds us that true power is not found in money, authority, or speed, but in patience, dignity, and quiet care. It shows that real change does not come from forcing outcomes or seeking recognition, but from choosing to do what is right, even when no one is watching. By slowing down, respecting others, and refusing to turn kindness into a transaction, we create trust that lasts and impact that grows on its own. The story teaches that dignity is built stitch by stitch, and when we honor people instead of rushing past them, we don't just fix problems, we change lives. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.